Cop shoots black woman at traffic stop, unaware she is a U.S. Army colonel. It was a quiet afternoon as Jacqueline Williams, a highly respected U.S. Army colonel, drove through the calm suburban streets of her neighborhood. She had just finished a meeting at a nearby military base and was heading to her next destination. As she approached a light, the routine of her drive was interrupted by the sudden flash of blue and red lights behind her. A police officer had pulled her over. Jacqueline, a woman in her 40s, had been through a lot in her life. She had served in various countries, had risen through the ranks of the military, and had earned the respect of her peers. She wore her uniform with pride when she was at work, but today she was dressed in civilian clothes. Her car was nothing special, just a regular sedan, but it was her, Jacqueline, who commanded attention in any setting. She looked into the rearview mirror, seeing the officer approach her vehicle. His face was young, probably in his mid-20s, and his uniform looked fresh, as if he had just joined the force. The officer's walk was brisk, but there was something in his posture that seemed uncertain. As he reached her window, she immediately noticed his tense body language. He didn't smile, and his eyes darted between her and her car's interior, clearly scanning for something. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the officer said, his voice carrying a note of caution. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Jacqueline had been a soldier for too long to react to such situations with anything but calm professionalism. She knew how to manage tense situations, whether in a foreign country or in the middle of a domestic traffic stop. She maintained eye contact with the officer, giving him a respectful nod as she responded. "No, I'm not sure, officer. Was I speeding?" The officer hesitated. He looked at her for a moment before speaking again. "I noticed you made a right turn without signaling. That's why I stopped you." Jacqueline, not wanting to argue over a minor infraction, nodded and quickly reached for her registration and license. She handed him her documents with a steady hand. She understood the importance of following the rules of the road, and she also knew the officer was just doing his job. The officer took the papers from her, but instead of walking back to his patrol car like most officers would, he lingered by the window, his eyes shifting back and forth. Jacqueline's heart rate stayed steady. She was used to high-pressure situations, being in combat zones, leading troops, making life-and-death decisions. This, however, was just a simple traffic stop. There was no reason to let the officer's unease shake her calm. "Can I ask what you do for a living, ma'am?" the officer asked, his tone now more curious than professional. Jacqueline didn't mind the question. After all, she had a lot of pride in her career, and it was always a good opportunity to speak about the importance of military service. She looked at him and replied, "I'm a colonel in the U.S. Army." The officer's eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of confusion in his expression. He seemed to be processing the information, but instead of recognizing the gravity of the situation, his demeanor shifted ever so slightly. Was it distrust? Was it suspicion? Jacqueline didn't fully understand why his body language changed, but she knew enough about people to recognize when someone was out of their depth. Perhaps the officer didn't meet many military personnel, especially ones of her rank, outside of a formal setting. She knew how it felt to be misunderstood or judged by appearances, but she was not going to let that interfere with her composure. "I've been in service for over 20 years, she added, trying to make him understand that she was more than just another driver in a civilian car. The officer didn't respond immediately. He shifted on his feet, glancing toward his patrol car, then back at her. For a moment, Jacqueline thought he might ask more questions, but instead, he seemed to hesitate again. She could feel the tension in the air thickening, and the unnerving silence that stretched between them made her uneasy. She couldn't quite figure out what was causing the change in the officer's behavior. Why was he acting so? On edge. "I'm just going to run your license and registration, ma'am," the officer finally said, his voice stiff and clipped. "Of course," Jacqueline responded calmly, even though she could feel the knot in her stomach growing tighter. She had been through hundreds of traffic stops, and this one was no different in terms of procedure, but something felt off. She could sense that the officer was more unsettled than he let on. As he turned and walked back to his car, Jacqueline kept her eyes on him. She observed the way he kept his hand near his belt, near his weapon. His movements were sharp, almost exaggerated. There was no real reason for that. He wasn't facing a threat, but it was there. His body language screamed tension. Jacqueline knew that, regardless of her rank or status, she was just another black woman in America at that moment, and that fact was not lost on her. She had seen enough of the headlines, heard the stories of innocent people, especially people of color, who had been pulled over for minor infractions only to end up in life-threatening situations. She knew how quickly things could escalate. As she sat in her car, she began to reflect on her life, the struggles, the triumphs, the challenges she had overcome. She had faced gunfire on the front lines, dealt with countless high-stakes situations, and had even lost friends in battle. But this felt different. It wasn't a battlefield she was in. It was supposed to be a simple stop. And yet here she was, starting to feel the weight of something much bigger than just a traffic violation. She watched as the officer returned to his patrol car, but her mind wandered. She thought about her service, her family, her friends in the army. All of them would be surprised to know that something like this was happening. They would never have imagined that a routine traffic stop could turn into something far more complicated. And then she thought about the officer's eyes, which had widened when she told him she was in the military. There had been a brief flicker of recognition, maybe even awe, but that quickly shifted back to uncertainty, and for reasons Jacqueline couldn't pinpoint, some form of distrust. Why is he so nervous? She thought to herself, barely able to comprehend why he was so on edge. She had seen fear in many eyes before, but this was different. This wasn't fear for his own safety, it was something else. Something less familiar. Was it suspicion? Was it fear of her based solely on her race and her presence? The question lingered in her mind. She sighed quietly and adjusted her rear-view mirror. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she was certain of one thing: this was no ordinary traffic stop. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was about to escalate into something far more dangerous. The officer finally returned to her car, his hand still close to his sidearm. His body stiffened as he reached for the window to speak again, and Jacqueline's heart skipped a beat. The calm, controlled demeanor she had relied on for years in the military was now being tested like never before. Something about this situation felt like it was teetering on the edge, and she couldn't yet tell what would tip it over. As Jacqueline sat in her car, the sound of her steady breathing filled the silence, her mind running over the details of the stop. The officer had gone back to his patrol car, and she sat there, trying to remain calm. She had been through situations far more dangerous than this, but something about this moment felt different. There was a tightness in her chest she couldn't shake. The officer was still at his car. From her rearview mirror, Jacqueline could see him typing into his computer, likely checking her information. The soft glow from the patrol car's dashboard lit up his face, but she couldn't tell what he was thinking. He kept glancing toward her car, and it made her uneasy. Something was off. She tried to calm herself. It was just a traffic stop after all. But as the seconds ticked by, she began to wonder why it was taking so long. Officers usually didn't spend so much time running a license check. Why was he so focused on her, so wary? Jacqueline let out a small sigh. She knew how to handle herself. After all, she had been through rigorous training to deal with situations like this. Calm, composed, focused on the mission at hand. But there was no denying that the air between them was thick with something unspoken. It was as if the officer's tension was spreading through the entire scene, like a quiet storm ready to break. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. She had an important meeting to attend, and the longer she sat there, the more she started to feel the weight of the time slipping away. Jacqueline had led troops in war zones, made decisions in the heat of battle, and had faced down some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. Yet here she was, wondering why a simple traffic stop had taken such a strange turn. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel, and her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the officer's behavior. She had given him all the necessary documents without delay. She had explained her background, and she had been polite. What had caused this delay? Why wasn't he just issuing a warning or a ticket and letting her go? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the officer's footsteps as he made his way back to her car. Jacqueline looked up and saw him approach, his posture now more rigid than before. His hand was near his belt again, and his movements were sharp, almost as if he was preparing for something. There was no reason for him to be this tense. She hadn't made any threatening gestures, but it was clear that something was brewing between them. The officer reached the window again, his face a mixture of uncertainty and something Jacqueline couldn't quite place. He looked at her, his eyes darting between her face and the documents she had handed him earlier. "I'm afraid I'll need to ask you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice a little shakier than before. Jacqueline's heart skipped a beat. "Step out of the vehicle?" she repeated, her voice calm but with a slight edge. She had been in situations where she had been ordered to exit a vehicle before, but it was never like this. Something felt off, and she could sense the officer's growing anxiety. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the car," he insisted, his tone firm but not entirely sure. He was giving her an order, but there was no real explanation for why he was escalating the situation. Jacqueline could feel the confusion and fear bubbling just below the surface in his voice. It was as if he was acting on instinct, but it wasn't an instinct born from professionalism. It felt like fear. Jacqueline hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. She could feel her military training kicking in, the training she had received to handle high-stress situations. But there was something unsettling about the officer's behavior. Why had he gone from a simple traffic stop to demanding she get out of the car? "Is there a reason for this?" Jacqueline asked calmly, her tone still respectful but firm. "I've complied with everything so far. There's no need to escalate this." The officer didn't answer immediately. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, looking at her through the window. For a moment, Jacqueline saw him hesitate, like he was wrestling with something internally. His hand was still near his gun, and she noticed how his eyes kept flicking toward her, almost like he was afraid of what she might do next. There was a long pause before the officer spoke again, this time more forcefully. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle. It's for your safety and mine." His words didn't make sense. There was nothing dangerous about the situation. Jacqueline wasn't a threat to him, and she had complied with everything he asked so far. Jacqueline was beginning to feel the first signs of frustration. She had tried to remain calm, but the officer's actions were becoming more confusing by the minute. He was overreacting, and it was clear that the situation was escalating in a way that made no sense. "I'm not going to argue with you, officer," she said, her voice steady but a little more direct. "But I need you to explain why I need to get out of the car." "There's no reason for this." The officer stood still for a moment, his face tight. Jacqueline could see that he was unsure of how to proceed. His hand hovered near his gun again, and the tension in the air thickened. It was like every movement had become more deliberate, more calculated. He wasn't thinking clearly. The more Jacqueline observed, the more she realized that this wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. It was something deeper, something that neither of them could easily explain. As Jacqueline prepared to exit the vehicle, she kept her movements slow and deliberate, showing no sign of aggression. She could feel the officer's eyes following her every move, his body tense as he waited for her to make the next move. "I'm going to open the door," she said, her voice carrying the calm assurance she had been trained to maintain. She unbuckled her seatbelt and reached for the handle, ready to step out of the car. But as her hand touched the door handle, something inside her told her to pause. Her instincts, honed over years of military service, screamed at her to think, to analyze the situation carefully. Was it worth getting out of the car? Was she in immediate danger? Before she could fully process the thought, the officer took another step toward her, his posture shifting from uncertainty to something more aggressive. The movement was too fast, too sudden. "Ma'am, step out now," he shouted, his voice now filled with urgency. Jacqueline's heart raced. She could feel the situation slipping out of her control. Without thinking, she opened the door, but as she started to stand, the officer's hand darted to his sidearm, and that's when she heard the loud crack of the gunshot. The world seemed to freeze for a split second as Jacqueline felt the sharp sting of the gunshot. The sound was deafening, reverberating in her ears long after the echo had faded. Her body jerked involuntarily as the force of the bullet tore through her side. The pain hit her like a wave, sharp and overwhelming. For a moment, her vision blurred, and her body went rigid as she struggled to breathe. Jacqueline's first instinct was to look down to assess the damage. Her hand moved to her side, feeling the warmth of her own blood soaking through her clothes. The shock of it was like nothing she had ever experienced before. The pain was immediate, searing, and intense, but more than the pain, it was the confusion that rattled her. Why had he shot her? In all her years of service, Jacqueline had never been in a situation like this. She had faced threats, danger, and moments where her life was on the line, but nothing had ever happened like this before. The officer had shot her, a black woman. A woman who had served her country with pride, who had led soldiers into battle, and who had given her all for the safety of others. The officer's voice broke through her stunned silence. "Ma'am, I didn't mean to." His words came out in a jumble, full of panic and disbelief. Jacqueline could barely hear him over the ringing in her ears, but she could sense his fear. He was terrified, and yet somehow his terror only added to the chaos. She wanted to scream, to shout at him, to demand why he had pulled the trigger, but the pain was too intense. Her breath came in short, painful gasps, and she knew she had to focus if she was going to survive this. She tried to lift her hand from her side to reach for her phone, to call for help, but the strength wasn't there. Her arms felt like lead, and her vision continued to swim in and out of focus. She could hear the officer shouting for backup, his voice growing more frantic, but she couldn't make sense of anything beyond the agony that consumed her. With great effort, Jacqueline managed to shift in her seat, trying to lean against the door for some support. She had been trained for many things: combat, survival, leadership, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw, immediate violence of this moment. The world outside the car was spinning. The sounds of sirens grew louder in the distance, but everything felt distant. She focused on her breathing, trying to stay conscious, trying to keep herself calm. "You're going to be okay," the officer said, his voice shaking. He sounded like he was trying to reassure her, but his words felt hollow, empty. He hadn't acted with any understanding of the severity of the situation. He hadn't thought about what his actions would mean. His panic only made everything worse. Jacqueline closed her eyes briefly, forcing herself to think. She had been in situations before where the stakes were life and death, but she had always remained focused, always found a way to stay in control. This was different. She was no longer in control. She wasn't sure what would happen next. The sirens were now blaring in her ears, the sound growing louder as more police cars arrived on the scene. She could hear footsteps, shouting, people moving around her, but her mind couldn't process it all. She could feel the cold sweat running down her back, her body trembling with the shock of what had just happened. "Stay with me, ma'am." She heard the officer's voice again, this time softer, more urgent. He seemed to be trying to reassure her, but his words felt like they were coming from a great distance. But Jacqueline wasn't sure if she could hold on much longer. The pain in her side was unbearable. She could feel the blood soaking through her clothes, the coldness of it spreading through her body. It was getting harder to focus, harder to keep her thoughts together. She forced her eyes open, the world still spinning around her. The officer was standing outside her car, looking at her with wide, terrified eyes. He hadn't meant to shoot her, she knew that. But the fact that he had done so, without understanding the full consequences of his actions, made everything so much worse. The officer moved toward her slowly, hesitating. Jacqueline could hear him calling for help again, but it felt like the world around her was moving in slow motion. Every sound, every movement seemed muffled, like she was underwater. "Hang in there, ma'am." "We're going to get you help," the officer said, his voice barely audible now. He reached for the door handle, then paused, his hand hovering over it, unsure of what to do next. The panic in his eyes mirrored the growing panic in Jacqueline's chest. "Don't." "Just don't," Jacqueline managed to croak, the words barely escaping her lips. She wanted to tell him to stay away, to stop, to give her a moment to think. But all she could do was gasp for air as the pain continued to overwhelm her senses. The officer's face twisted with guilt, his hand shaking as he tried to open the door. But Jacqueline couldn't focus on him anymore. She could feel the blood pooling in her body, the sharp pain radiating outward. It was getting harder and harder to keep her eyes open. Her vision blurred once again, and she felt herself slipping, falling into unconsciousness. She had been through countless trials, countless battles, but this was something else entirely. This was fear, not the kind that came from facing down an enemy in a faraway land, but the kind that gripped her right here, in her own country, in her own community. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and soon she could hear paramedics rushing to her side. She tried to focus on their voices, but her body felt like it was fading away. She could feel the life draining out of her, the sharp, cold edges of the world around her starting to blur. The officer was still there, shouting something at her, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except the overwhelming pain and the desperate need to survive. The world felt distant. Jacqueline's mind was foggy, as though she were floating outside of her own body. Her thoughts drifted like wisps of smoke in the air. but the pain in her side kept pulling her back to the harsh reality of the situation. She could feel the warmth of her blood soaking through her clothes, and the pressure of it all weighed heavily on her chest. Her vision swam in and out, the lights from the sirens above blurring into streaks of red and blue. The paramedics arrived with urgency, their footsteps heavy and fast. One of them leaned over her, their hands moving quickly, checking her pulse, her breathing, assessing the damage. She could hear their muffled voices, but it all felt like an echo, as if she were hearing it from far away. "She's losing blood fast. We need to get her to the hospital now," one of the paramedics shouted. Jacqueline's eyes fluttered open as they began moving her onto a stretcher. The sudden movement sent a wave of pain through her body, sharp and dizzying, but she gritted her teeth and fought to stay conscious. She had faced worse, far worse, but this moment felt different. She wasn't sure what was happening to her or why it was happening at all. The officer who had shot her was still standing nearby, his face pale and full of regret. Jacqueline could barely focus on him, her mind too clouded by the shock of the injury. She could hear his voice, but it seemed to come from a long way off. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know," he stammered, his words trailing off. There was a brokenness in his voice, as if he were searching for a way to explain himself, but he couldn't. His hands were shaking, and he was frozen in place, watching as the paramedics worked around Jacqueline. Jacqueline wanted to scream at him, to demand why he had done this, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt dry, and every breath she took was labored. The last thing she wanted to do was give this officer the satisfaction of thinking that he had hurt her. She had been through too much to let this moment define her. As the paramedics carefully lifted her into the ambulance, Jacqueline could hear the commotion of people around her. The sirens wailed as they sped toward the hospital, but her world remained hazy. The weight of the situation settled on her like a heavy blanket, and the questions began to surface in her mind. How had it come to this? How had a simple traffic stop spiraled into something so dangerous? Jacqueline had spent years in the military, following orders, leading troops, making critical decisions in life-and-death situations. She had always been in control, always trusted her instincts. But this was different. The officer's fear and misunderstanding had changed everything. She had been caught in the middle of something that was much bigger than a simple traffic violation. The ambulance ride felt like an eternity. The paramedics worked quickly, doing what they could to stabilize her. Jacqueline felt the pressure of their hands on her body, their attempts to control the bleeding, but the pain never stopped. It pulsed through her like a constant reminder that her life had been irrevocably altered in the blink of an eye. As the ambulance neared the hospital, Jacqueline's thoughts began to wander. She thought of her family, her children, her parents, her siblings. None of them would ever have imagined that she would end up here, lying on a stretcher, injured by the very people who were supposed to protect her. She thought of her colleagues in the military, people who trusted her, who looked up to her as a leader. They would never understand why this had happened. They would never know the terror of being on the receiving end of such a careless, reckless action. And then there was the officer. She couldn't help but wonder what had gone through his mind in that split second before he pulled the trigger. Was it fear? Was it racial bias? Or was it something else entirely? She didn't know, but she knew one thing for sure. He hadn't considered the consequences. He hadn't thought about the human being sitting in that car, about the woman who had fought for her country, about the life he was about to take. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed through Jacqueline's chest, and they wheeled her into the emergency room. The bright lights above her head seemed to flicker as the medical team immediately sprang into action. Nurses and doctors moved around her with precision, working to save her life. Jacqueline felt herself slipping, but she fought to hold on. Her military training had taught her to endure, to survive, and this was just another battle. She had to win it. Her thoughts were interrupted as she heard one of the doctors say, "We need to prepare her for surgery. Get the oar ready now." The urgency in his voice fueled her determination. She had been through so much, faced so many obstacles, and yet here she was, still alive, still fighting. Jacqueline wasn't going to give up. Not now, not when she had so much more to live for. In the midst of the chaos, Jacqueline thought back to the officer. She wondered how he would feel once the dust settled. How would he face the reality of what he had done? It wasn't just about the shooting. It was about the choices he had made along the way he had seen her or not seen her in that moment. Jacqueline had spent her whole life working to prove that she was more than just a stereotype, more than just a label. She had earned her place, her respect, through years of hard work, sacrifice, and leadership. But in that instant, she had been reduced to something else entirely, a target. She wanted him to understand that. She wanted him to know that his actions had consequences, that there was more to a person than what met the eye. But for now, she couldn't dwell on him. She had to focus on herself, on surviving, on getting through this moment. As the team prepped her for surgery, Jacqueline allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about what had been taken from her sense of security, her trust in the system, the belief that the people who were supposed to protect her would always do so. But she also thought about what she still had, her life, her strength, her will to fight. This was not the end. It couldn't be. The days that followed were a blur for Jacqueline. After the emergency surgery, she was kept under close observation in the hospital. The doctors did their best to stabilize her, but the injury was severe. Her body was bruised, her spirit tested, but Jacqueline was nothing if not resilient. She fought through the haze of pain and exhaustion, pushing herself to stay awake, to stay alert. The fight for her life wasn't over yet. When she finally regained full consciousness, her first thoughts were not of herself, but of the people who needed to know what had happened. Her family, her friends in the military, her colleagues, they all needed answers. They needed to know why she had been shot by a police officer in a situation that had been nothing more than a routine traffic stop. But the questions started to pile up. How had it gone so wrong? Why had the officer escalated a simple situation to the point of using deadly force? And most importantly, what would happen to the officer who had shot her? Would there be accountability, or would this just be another case brushed under the rug? The investigation into the shooting began almost immediately. The police department was quick to respond, sending a team of detectives to review the body cam footage from the officer's patrol car. The officer himself was placed on administrative leave while the department conducted an internal review. The shooting was being treated as a potential case of excessive force. Jacqueline's case became the focus of a media storm. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and soon it was a national conversation. The headlines screamed out the facts. A black woman, an Army colonel, had been shot by a police officer during a routine traffic stop. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some demanded justice for Jacqueline, calling for the officer to be held accountable. Others argued that the officer had acted out of fear, that he had been justified in his actions. But Jacqueline knew better. She knew that this wasn't about fear. This was about something deeper, about how the officer had seen her, how he had treated her, based on nothing more than her appearance. As the investigation progressed, new details began to emerge. Witnesses who had been at the scene gave conflicting accounts of what had happened. Some said they had seen Jacqueline exit the car calmly, while others claimed she had made sudden movements that could have been perceived as a threat. But the one thing that stood out to everyone was the officer's reaction. He had been nervous from the start, hesitant even when Jacqueline had handed over her documents. His body language had been tense, as though he was prepared for something to go wrong, even though there had been no reason for it. The police department's internal review revealed that the officer had a history of making questionable decisions during stops, but nothing had ever led to an incident like this. His actions were scrutinized, and it became clear that his fear had overshadowed his training. Jacqueline had been a victim of that fear, a fear that had nothing to do with her actions, but everything to do with how the officer perceived her. She was just another black woman to him, and that made her a potential threat in his eyes. The officer's background also came under close examination. It was revealed that he had been involved in multiple encounters with people of color that had raised concerns within the department. But up until that point, none of those incidents had escalated to violence. He had never been disciplined, and there had been no significant consequences for his actions. This, Jacqueline thought, was the real issue. The officer had been allowed to continue his career without being held accountable for his behavior, and now someone had been hurt because of it. Meanwhile, Jacqueline's recovery continued at the hospital. Her body had begun to heal, but the emotional scars ran deeper than any physical wound. She couldn't stop thinking about the incident, replaying the events in her mind over and over again. The fear in the officer's eyes, the panic in his voice, and the sharp pain of the bullet had been burned into her memory. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had been stolen from her. The trust she had once had in law enforcement, in the system that was supposed to protect her, had been shattered. Her family came to visit her frequently, offering support and comfort, but even they could see how much the shooting had affected her. Her children, especially, were struggling to understand why this had happened to their mother. They were too young to grasp the full scope of the situation, but they could feel the fear and uncertainty that hung in the air. Jacqueline tried to reassure them, to tell them that she was going to be okay, but deep down, she knew that things would never be the same. She couldn't protect them from the reality of what had happened, and she couldn't shield them from the painful truth that people who were supposed to protect them might view them through a lens of suspicion. The pressure on the police department continued to mount. Activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens began to demand transparency. The officer who had shot Jacqueline was placed on leave, but there was no word yet on whether he would face any charges. The department promised a full investigation, but Jacqueline was skeptical. She had seen how quickly these types of cases were swept under the rug. She had seen how easily those in power could avoid accountability, especially when the victim was someone like her. But Jacqueline wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't. She knew that this case was about more than just her. It was about every person of color who had been mistreated, misunderstood, or wrongfully accused. It was about the systemic issues that ran deep within law enforcement, the biases that colored every interaction, and the lives that had been lost because of them. Jacqueline had spent her entire career fighting for justice, for fairness, and for equality. She wasn't going to stop now. As the investigation continued, Jacqueline began to prepare for what lay ahead. She knew that the road to justice would be long and difficult, but she was ready for it. She had been through battles before, both on the battlefield and in her personal life. She had learned to fight when it mattered, and this time was no different. The officer's actions had wounded her, but they had also sparked something inside her, something stronger than the pain. It was a sense of purpose, a determination to make sure that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else. And so, as the investigation into the shooting continued, Jacqueline made a decision. She would use her voice, her experience, and her platform to bring attention to the issues that had led to this moment. She would fight for accountability, for justice, and for change. And no matter how long it took, no matter how hard the journey, she would make sure that her story would not be forgotten. The days and weeks after the incident felt like a blur for Colonel Angela Roberts. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow a little darker, and every passing car made her heart skip. She had spent her life in the military, trained to face danger calmly, but nothing had prepared her for the confusion and fear of that evening. The memory of the traffic stop played over and over in her mind, like a video stuck on repeat. She remembered the officer's sudden movement, her own instinct to protect herself, and the shock that followed. Even though she had survived, the event had shaken her deeply. Angela's body healed faster than her mind. The physical pain gradually faded, leaving only bruises and scars as reminders of that night. But the mental weight lingered. She struggled to sleep, often waking in the middle of the night, reliving the moment over and over. The world that had always seemed predictable now felt unpredictable. Trust, which had been second nature to her, became a fragile and careful choice. Even in familiar places, she found herself scanning her surroundings with a caution she had never known before. Her family surrounded her with love and support, but even their presence could not completely erase the anxiety. Her husband, Mark, tried to offer comfort with words, hugs, and gentle encouragement, but Angela often felt that no one could truly understand the mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief she carried. Her children, young and innocent, asked questions that broke her heart. "Why did it happen, Mom?" And she struggled to explain in a way that was honest but did not burden them with fear. She realized that part of her recovery would be learning to separate the trauma from her family life, to protect them from the shadows that lingered inside her. Meanwhile, the investigation into the incident became a constant presence in Angela's life. Authorities interviewed her repeatedly, and each session forced her to relive the night in minute detail. She tried to stay calm and precise, knowing that her words could influence outcomes, but sometimes the memories overwhelmed her. She also found herself reflecting on the broader implications. She knew her case would become part of a larger conversation about policing, race, and respect for individuals who serve their country. Angela had never sought the spotlight, But now her story carried weight far beyond her own experience. Public reaction to the incident was intense. News outlets covered the story continuously, and social media discussions spread like wildfire. Many people expressed support, recognizing her service in the military and the injustice of the situation. Others debated what had gone wrong during the traffic stop, questioning training, protocols, and biases in law enforcement. Angela read some of these discussions cautiously. She did not want to get lost in anger or blame, but she understood that her story could spark change. She felt a responsibility to use her experience to raise awareness, even if it meant reliving pain in public. At the hospital and in her home, friends and colleagues reached out to offer help. Letters of support, flowers, and calls arrived daily. Some visitors shared stories of similar experiences, while others simply sat quietly, listening as Angela spoke about her feelings. She realized that these conversations, though difficult, helped her process what had happened. She began to recognize that recovery was not only about physical healing, but about connecting with others, sharing experiences, and finding ways to regain a sense of safety in the world. Angela also spent a great deal of time reflecting on Officer Reynolds. She did not want to harbor hatred, knowing that anger could consume her. Instead, she tried to see him as a human being who had made a critical mistake, one that had serious consequences. She hoped that the investigation would lead to learning, accountability, and improved understanding between law enforcement and the communities they serve. This perspective did not erase the trauma, but it allowed her to reclaim some measure of peace. As the weeks turned into months, Angela slowly returned to her routines. She resumed light exercise, began attending therapy sessions, and started engaging with her work in ways that felt safe. Each small step forward felt monumental. A walk in the park, a simple trip to the grocery store, or driving her own car again became victories. She learned to celebrate these moments, understanding that healing was a gradual process. Each day brought a little more confidence, a little more control, and a growing sense that life could continue beyond the shadow of that night. Angela's story also inspired broader conversations within her community. Local leaders invited her to speak about her experiences and the lessons learned. Her focus was not on blame or anger, but on awareness, communication, and empathy. She emphasized the importance of understanding, listening, and respecting one another, whether in everyday encounters or in positions of authority. Her message resonated with many, and she began to see that even the darkest experiences could lead to positive change if approached thoughtfully. One day, Angela visited the site of the traffic stop. It was just an ordinary street, lined with trees and familiar homes, but for her, it held the memory of a life-altering moment. She walked slowly, observing the surroundings, and noticed small details she had never seen before. A bird perched on a fence, sunlight filtering through the leaves, a child playing on a front lawn. She realized that the world continued to hold beauty, even amidst fear and confusion. This visit was symbolic, a way to reclaim space that had been tainted by trauma and to remind herself that life moved forward, even after difficult experiences. Through therapy and reflection, Angela also began to explore forgiveness, not as a way to excuse what had happened, but as a means to free herself from the constant weight of anger. She learned to separate the act from the person, to acknowledge mistakes, and to see opportunities for growth. This approach helped her navigate interactions with others, maintain her emotional health, and rebuild a sense of trust in the world. As the investigation concluded, changes began to take place within the police department. Training programs were reviewed, policies were adjusted, and conversations about bias, communication, and empathy became part of ongoing education. Angela participated in some of these discussions, providing a perspective grounded in experience rather than theory. She realized that while her story had begun with fear and confusion, it could now contribute to understanding, safety, and progress. By the time a full year had passed, Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose. She continued to serve in the military, returned to her family with deeper appreciation, and engaged in community work that emphasized connection and understanding. She no longer avoided streets or cars out of fear, and she found herself able to drive without tension or anxiety. The memories remained, but they no longer controlled her. Instead, they reminded her of resilience, courage, and the power of facing life's unexpected challenges with strength and grace. In quiet moments, Angela reflected on the journey. She understood that recovery was not a straight path, but a series of steps, some small, some large, that gradually rebuilt confidence, trust, and hope. She also recognized that her story had a wider significance, showing that even in difficult circumstances, people could learn, grow, and create positive change. It was a story about fear, resilience, healing, and the ability to reclaim life after an event that had seemed impossible to overcome. Ultimately, Angela's experience became a testament to the human spirit. She had faced danger, confusion, and trauma, yet she emerged with a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to understanding, and a belief that life could continue in meaningful and positive ways. Her story reminded those who heard it that even in moments of fear, courage and empathy could shine through, and that each person had the power to turn difficult experiences into opportunities for growth, awareness, and hope.